Picture this, you're a farmer in California's Imperial Valley in 1935. The government just spent millions bringing water to your land. You're promised prosperity, but within 5 years your crops are dying, your soil is turning white with salt, and the very system designed to make you rich is slowly poisoning everything you own. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how America's most ambitious irrigation project became a massive environmental disaster that destroyed over 200,000 acres of prime farmland. And here's the kicker: the engineers knew it would happen before they even built it. Before we dive into this catastrophe, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when government ambition meets bad science. Let's go back to the 1920s. The American West was the frontier of possibility. Deserts were seen as wastelands just waiting for human ingenuity to transform them into agricultural paradises. The Colorado River was this massive untapped resource, and politicians saw dollar signs. The Imperial Valley in Southern California was a perfect target, technically a desert, technically below sea level, but with one major advantage: rich soil that just needed water. So they built the All-American Canal, 82 miles of concrete and ambition, designed to carry Colorado River water straight into the Imperial Valley. It was an engineering marvel. Newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. The canal could move enough water to fill an Olympic swimming pool every 3 seconds. Farmers rushed in. Land that was worth nothing suddenly sold for premium prices. The government handed out irrigation contracts like candy on Halloween. But here's what nobody wanted to talk about. Every single gallon of Colorado River water was loaded with dissolved minerals. Salt, selenium, boron, you name it. The river had been picking up these minerals for hundreds of miles as it carved through the Southwest. In small amounts, not a problem. But when you're dumping millions of gallons onto fields every single day, those minerals don't just disappear, they accumulate. The engineers knew this. Internal documents from the Bureau of Reclamation show they understood the salinity problem from day one. They even calculated how long it would take before the soil became too toxic for most crops. Their estimate, about 15 to 20 years, but here's the insane part: they built it anyway. The political pressure was too strong. Congressmen wanted ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Developers wanted to sell land. Nobody wanted to be the person who said this was a terrible idea. Now let's talk about what happens when you irrigate desert soil with mineral-rich water. In most climates, rain washes salts down through the soil and into groundwater. But the Imperial Valley gets maybe 3 inches of rain per year. That means every time you irrigate, you're adding salt. And when that water evaporates in the 100-plus-degree heat, which it does constantly, the salt stays behind. Year after year, layer after layer, the concentration builds. By 1940, farmers started noticing problems. Crops weren't growing as tall, yields were dropping. The soil was developing this weird white crust that looked like frost, except it never went away. Chemical tests revealed the truth. The salt concentration in the topsoil had increased by over 300% in just 5 years. Plants were literally being poisoned by the irrigation water meant to help them grow. But salt wasn't even the worst part. The selenium levels were becoming catastrophic. Selenium is a trace mineral that plants need in tiny amounts, but the Colorado River water had way too much. As it concentrated in the soil, it created a toxic environment. Certain crops started showing deformities. Livestock that grazed on irrigated pastures developed hoof problems and reproductive issues. The ecosystem was collapsing in real time. The farmers panicked and did the only thing they could think of: they used more water. The logic seemed sound. If salt is building up, just flush it through with more irrigation. Except this created an even bigger problem. All that extra water had to go somewhere. Without natural drainage in a below-sea-level valley, the water table started rising. Within a few years, many fields were becoming waterlogged. Roots can't breathe in waterlogged soil, so now farmers had too much salt and too much water. It was a death spiral. The government's solution? Build drains, miles and miles of underground drainage pipes to collect the toxic runoff and carry it away. This actually worked for a while. The drains lowered the water table and removed some of the salt, but here's the question nobody asked: where does all that poisoned water go? They dumped it into the Salton Sea, a massive lake that had accidentally formed in 1905 when Colorado River irrigation canals broke and flooded the valley. The Salton Sea became the toilet for the Imperial Valley's agricultural waste. Millions of gallons of salt-saturated, selenium-loaded, pesticide-laced water flowed into it every single day. By the 1950s, the Salton Sea had become more toxic than the ocean. Fish die-offs became routine. Birds that fed on the fish started showing up dead by the thousands. Meanwhile, back on the farms, the situation kept getting worse despite the drains. See, drains only work if you have somewhere to drain to, and they only remove water, not the salt that's already bonded into the soil structure. Farmers were trapped in an expensive cycle: constant irrigation to push salt down, constant drainage to remove water, constant fertilizer to compensate for toxic soil. The operating costs skyrocketed. By 1960, over 200,000 acres in the Imperial and Coachella valleys were classified as salt damaged. That's an area larger than New York City. Thousands of farmers went bankrupt. Small family operations couldn't afford the constant remediation costs. The land consolidated into the hands of massive agricultural corporations who could absorb the losses. The government's promise of creating prosperous small farms had turned into an environmental disaster that benefited only industrial agriculture. Here's the truly maddening part: this wasn't unique to California. The same pattern repeated across the entire American West. The Salt River Project in Arizona, the Rio Grande Project in New Mexico, the Columbia Basin Project in Washington. Every single one followed the same playbook: build massive irrigation infrastructure, ignore the salinity warnings, watch the soil degrade, implement expensive drainage systems, and leave farmers holding the bag. The Bureau of Reclamation's own studies in the 1970s admitted that over 1 million acres of Western farmland had been damaged by irrigation-induced salinity. The economic losses were estimated at over $3 billion in today's money. And that's just counting lost productivity, not the environmental cleanup costs or the destroyed ecosystems. What makes this even worse is that alternative approaches existed. The ancient Persians had figured out sustainable desert irrigation over 2,000 years ago using qanats and careful water management. Indigenous peoples in the Southwest had developed irrigation techniques that work with the environment instead of against it. But American engineers in the 1930s were so confident in their industrial approach that they ignored thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. So why did they do it? Why build systems that were basically poison delivery machines? Follow the money. Construction contracts were worth millions. Land developers made fortunes selling desert real estate as future farmland. Politicians got to claim they were tamming the West, and when everything went wrong, well, that wasn't anyone's specific fault. It was just unforeseen circumstances, except it wasn't unforeseen. It was completely predictable and predicted. The legacy of these decisions is still with us. The Salton Sea is now one of the worst environmental disasters in North America. As it evaporates, toxic dust blows across communities, giving children asthma. The Colorado River is so overallocated that it barely reaches the ocean anymore. Every drop is spoken for, mostly for irrigation that's still building up salt in soil across 7 states. We're still running the same poison delivery machines, just with better PR. And here's the final twist: we're doing it again right now. Massive irrigation projects are being built in Africa, Asia, and South America using the exact same assumptions that failed in 1930s America. International development banks are funding them. Engineering firms are designing them, and the salinity warnings are being ignored just like they were 90 years ago. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. The story of America's irrigation disasters isn't just about bad farming or unlucky weather. It's about what happens when ambition overrides science, when short-term profits matter more than long-term sustainability, and when the people making decisions never have to live with the consequences. Those 200,000 poison acres weren't destroyed by accident. They were destroyed by design, by a system that valued construction contracts over environmental reality. So the next time someone tells you that technology will solve our environmental problems, or that we can engineer our way out of natural limits, remember the Imperial Valley. Remember how concrete canals carrying poison water destroyed an area the size of a major city. Remember how the experts knew and built it anyway. Because the biggest lie isn't that we don't know better. It's that we do know better, and we keep making the same catastrophic choices over and over again. If this story made you rethink how we approach massive infrastructure projects, hit that like button and share this video. The more people who understand how these disasters happen, the harder it becomes to repeat them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. What's particularly fascinating is understanding the human psychology behind this entire disaster. The engineers and government officials involved weren't evil people plotting to destroy farmland. They were caught in a system where admitting uncertainty was career suicide. A hydrologist in the 1920s who said this might not work would be replaced by someone more optimistic. Politicians who questioned the project would lose funding for their districts. Construction companies had contracts worth millions of dollars. Once the momentum started, it became almost impossible to stop, even when the warning signs were impossible to ignore. This reveals something uncomfortable about how large organizations make decisions. Individual people can know something is wrong and still participate in doing it, because the incentive structures are misaligned. A single engineer's concerns get buried in reports that nobody reads. A scientist's warnings get dismissed as being too cautious or not understanding practical constraints. The people making the final decisions are far removed from the people who have to live with the consequences. By the time farmers discovered their soil was poisoned, the construction contracts were already fulfilled. The politicians had moved on to other districts, and the companies had already spent their profits. The drainage system they built to fix the problem is itself a fascinating case study in throwing money at symptoms instead of addressing root causes. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars installing miles of pipes, treatment facilities, and evaporation ponds. All of this infrastructure required constant maintenance and operation. It created permanent jobs for water management agencies, which meant they had an incentive to keep running the system even when it wasn't working well. You've now created a bureaucracy that benefits from the problem continuing to exist. Meanwhile, the farmers caught in the middle had almost no recourse. They couldn't sue the government because of sovereign immunity laws. They couldn't stop using irrigation because their land was already destroyed without it. They couldn't sell their land for much because everyone knew it was contaminated. They were trapped in an economic cage of their own government's design. Some farmers tried different crops, thinking maybe certain plants could tolerate the salt better. A few actually succeeded temporarily. But eventually, even salt-tolerant crops accumulated enough toxins to fail. The Salton Sea part of this story deserves much more attention than it usually gets. This massive inland lake that nobody planned for became the dumping ground for all the valley's sins. By the 1960s and 70s, it was an ecological catastrophe. The water was so saline that normal fish couldn't survive. Only a few hardy species adapted to the toxic conditions. When algae bloomed in the nutrient-rich poisoned water, decomposition would consume all the oxygen, creating dead zones where nothing could live. Bird populations that depended on the lake crashed dramatically. Communities around the Salton Sea started experiencing health problems. The dust from the evaporating lake, loaded with salt and agricultural chemicals, would blow across residential areas during windstorms. Respiratory issues became common. Birth defects showed up in clusters. Children developed asthma at rates far above the national average. Nobody was tracking these health impacts systematically at first because there was no institutional pressure to do so. It was only when independent researchers started documenting the problem that anyone paid attention. What's truly infuriating is that the solution to this problem was always available. They could have designed the irrigation system completely differently. Drip irrigation technology existed even back in the 1930s, though it wasn't widespread. They could have implemented crop rotation practices that would have helped break down salt accumulation. They could have invested in soil remediation techniques instead of just applying more water. They could have limited irrigation to quantities that the natural rainfall and drainage could actually handle. But none of these options generated the massive construction contracts that made politicians look good in ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The international dimension of this problem continues to expand today. We're seeing the exact same pattern play out in Central Asia, where massive irrigation projects on the Aral Sea have turned what was once the world's fourth-largest lake into a toxic wasteland. The Aral Sea has shrunk to a fraction of its original size, leaving behind poisoned sediments and destroyed fishing communities. In South Asia, over-irrigation of the Indus and Ganges river systems is building up salt in soils across millions of acres. Groundwater in many agricultural regions is becoming too saline for irrigation, which would be ironic if it weren't so tragic. Africa is about to repeat this exact mistake on a massive scale. The Nile is being dammed at multiple points. The Niger River is being diverted for irrigation. The same international development agencies that funded the Western irrigation disasters are funding these projects. The same engineering firms that learned nothing from history are designing them. And the same patterns are emerging. Ignored salinity warnings, unrealistic benefit projections, and local communities who will bear the costs while distant investors capture the profits. What makes this particularly infuriating is that the technology and knowledge to avoid this problem has existed for decades. Soil scientists understand salinity management. Hydrologists know how to balance water budgets. Agricultural engineers can design systems that work with ecosystems instead of against them. Israel, despite facing extreme water scarcity, has developed irrigation techniques that minimize salinity buildup. But these approaches don't generate the same level of profit and don't give the same opportunities for corruption and kickbacks that massive infrastructure projects do. The political economy of large infrastructure projects creates perverse incentives that almost guarantee poor long-term outcomes. The benefits are concentrated in immediate construction jobs, politician visibility, corporation profits. The costs are dispersed and delayed. Environmental degradation, public health impacts, economic losses spread across time. This time asymmetry means that decision-makers get all the credit for the benefits and never face the consequences of the costs. The political system is literally structured to encourage repeating the same mistakes. Consider how the Bureau of Reclamation evolved after these disasters. Did it shut down? Did it acknowledge the systematic failures and reform? No, it just got bigger and more entrenched. It became the largest water management agency in the country with a permanent bureaucracy dedicated to building more dams and irrigation systems. Within this organization, questioning whether a project should be built at all is basically heresy. Your career advances by proposing new projects, getting them approved, and overseeing construction. Nobody gets promoted for preventing environmental disasters. This institutional momentum is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the whole situation. Individual people within the agency might recognize problems, but the organizational structure actively suppresses that information and incentivizes optimism. Environmental impact assessments became standard eventually, but they're often written by consultants hired by the project proponents, creating obvious conflicts of interest. Politicians want the same thing that agencies want, to point to completed infrastructure and claim victory. The local communities who will suffer the consequences have very little political power. The farmers who got destroyed by the Imperial Valley disaster didn't organize effectively into a political force. They were geographically scattered, economically weakened, and facing an opponent with vastly more resources and political influence. By the time the full scope of the problem became obvious, it was too late to prevent the disaster. They could only try to manage its consequences. Some farmers did fight back legally, but the government's sovereign immunity and the sheer complexity of causation made legal remedies nearly impossible to obtain. What's remarkable in retrospect is how little accountability there was. No high-level officials were held responsible. No agency was shut down. No executives were prosecuted. The government simply acknowledged that mistakes were made, allocated some money for mitigation, and moved on to building more projects based on the same flawed assumptions. This lack of accountability sent a clear message. You can cause massive environmental disasters and destroy thousands of people's livelihoods and face essentially no personal consequences. This history matters today because we're facing similar choices about energy infrastructure, water management, and large-scale engineering projects. We're told that we need massive interventions to solve climate change, which might be true. But the history of the Bureau of Reclamation should make us extremely cautious about trusting massive centralized infrastructure as the solution. We should be demanding much more rigorous analysis of unintended consequences. We should require that the people proposing these projects have skin in the game and will suffer if things go wrong. The other lesson is about the importance of local knowledge and community input. The indigenous people and traditional farmers who understood the region had methods that worked sustainably for centuries, but they were overruled by educated engineers from distant cities who were confident in their superior expertise. Modern development still makes this same mistake constantly. We assume that centralized, technical solutions are always better than local, adaptive management. History suggests we should be much more humble about what we think we know. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about the nature of risk and uncertainty in complex systems. The salinity problem in the Imperial Valley wasn't just unpredicted, it was considered and then deliberately ignored because the upfront benefits seemed so attractive. We do this constantly with modern technology. We know that chemicals persist in the environment and we use them anyway. We know that greenhouse gases trap heat and we emit them anyway. We know that financial systems can collapse catastrophically and we design them the same way anyway. It's not ignorance, it's a choice to prioritize immediate, measurable benefits over delayed, uncertain costs. Making better choices requires changing the incentive structures that reward this kind of short-term thinking. It means building accountability into systems so that decision-makers actually have to face consequences for bad outcomes. It means empowering local communities to reject or modify projects that will affect their land. It means investing in ongoing monitoring and adjustment rather than one-time construction and hopping for the best. It means being honest about uncertainty instead of pretending that technical expertise can eliminate it. These changes won't happen automatically. They require political will and structural reform, but the alternative is continuing to build poison landscapes while claiming we couldn't have known better. Thanks for diving deep into this history with me today.